People of Reddit who caught their partner cheating. How did you do that? And what was your reaction? I came home early from my second job to spend time with her and our infant son. As soon as I walked in, I noticed an extra pair of shoes by the door. I quietly made my way up the stairs, but I hit a creaky step, and I heard them both scramble. She quickly met me at the top of the stairs, zipping up her sweater, with her pants still unbuttoned. He was still getting dressed as I looked into the room and saw everything I needed to see. I snapped and started yelling. She tried to push me downstairs so we could argue away from our son's room. Once we got into the living room, I started screaming louder than I ever had before. I don't remember all the words. I kind of blanked out, but I'm sure I mentioned how we were engaged and how he was supposed to be my best man. They tried to calm me down, but I couldn't control it. I stormed out of the house and walked up the street to where his wife, her maid of honor, worked. I asked her to come outside so we could talk. I told her everything, and then I left her to handle it however she saw fit. After that, I called up a buddy of mine, told him to meet me at the bar, and made sure I didn't get drunk alone. Story 2. When I was 8 months pregnant with our second child, my ex-husband was sleeping with his best friend's wife. It had been going on for a while, and I had no idea. At the time, he wanted to visit his brother for the weekend, and I asked my doctor if it was safe for me to travel. She said it would be fine, so I offered to go with him. But he said he was hoping to just have some time with his brother, which I understood. A new baby makes it hard to find quality time for one another. So, I asked if he could take our older son, who was 3 at the time, so he could visit his grandma and cousins. He said they were planning on drinking and doing things like shooting, and wasn't sure it would be a good idea. I agreed, and he left for the weekend. After he left, I got a call from his best friend. It wasn't strange for him to call me because my husband was terrible at answering his phone. He asked if I wanted to meet up, and I told him that my husband was visiting family, so it wasn't a good time. He said okay, and hung up abruptly, but something felt off. Turns out, a few months earlier, his best friend had caught him and his wife together and confronted them. For some reason, he gave them a chance to make things right. He didn't tell me, but threatened to expose them if they didn't stop. Of course, they didn't stop, and he eventually did tell me. The worst part wasn't just the affair. It was that my husband's family knew and never said a word. These people had been my family for 5 years, and none of them thought to tell me what was really going on. It's been almost 10 years now, and while it was a painful experience, I'm so much happier now. It was definitely an eye-opening moment, but one that led me to a much better place. Story 3. I owned a house with my fiancé, and one night, I woke up in the middle of the night to find he wasn't in bed. I immediately started looking for him. I noticed his truck and another car parked in the driveway. When I went upstairs, I found the guest bedroom was locked. I knocked, but there was no answer, so I barged in. What I saw stopped me dead in my tracks. He was in bed with another woman. And that bed, it was my childhood bed. He didn't even hesitate. He physically grabbed me by the neck and shoved me out of the room, slamming the door shut behind him. I felt completely powerless at that moment, but I managed to call his parents, who lived just a few blocks away. His dad showed up, and another fight broke out. It was chaotic, and in the end, I ended up leaving and staying at his parents' place until morning. That weekend, I packed up and moved out. I let the house foreclose, walked away from everything, and started over. It took 9 years, but finally, it's off my credit report. Today, I'm happily married to an incredible man, and we own a beautiful home together. Life has gotten so much better. Story 4. One afternoon, I couldn't find my wife after she got off work. I called her phone multiple times, but she didn't answer. She didn't show up at the house until 9:30 p.m., and when she did, she spun some story about getting stuck in traffic. I wasn't buying it, so I decided to do some digging. I pulled up the State Farm driving app, which tracks your movements, and discovered that she had been leaving work early, heading to a nearby rest area off the expressway. There, she'd been meeting up with a 20-something trucker she'd met at her previous job. I couldn't let it slide, so I decided to interrupt her little rendezvous one afternoon. I drove to the rest area, parked right in front of his rig, and walked up to the truck. The cabin shade was drawn, so I pulled it back. What I saw inside was my wife, meth pipe in hand, going to town on this guy. He had the audacity to tell me to give them privacy. I didn't take it well. I called the cops, and they were both arrested for possession. I wasted no time. I filed for divorce immediately. The icing on the cake came a few months later when I found out she cheated on her new trucker boyfriend. Apparently, she's already on her 7th friend. Good luck, you wet, musty nightmare. Story 5. I had my suspicions about my husband, but the truth hit me when he was supposed to leave for a trip and came home early. He packed his bag and rushed out, barely saying goodbye to me or our kids. Living on the 5th floor of our apartment, I looked out the window and saw him get into the car of another woman. I could see through the sunroof, so I knew it was her. The look on the guard's face was priceless. Later, a woman called me. She was upset and claimed to be his fiancée. She worked for the airline and had found out he was traveling with another woman, the one I had seen him with earlier. This confirmed everything I suspected. My suspicions were further confirmed when I found a receipt in his briefcase from a high-end store. With my 2 kids in tow, one a toddler, the other still in a stroller, I went to the store and made up a story to find out what he had purchased. When they looked up the receipt, they said, "Oh yes, Mr. Z was here with his Thai wife." The woman at the store looked at me, hesitated, and then apologized, realizing the situation. I said it was fine, adding that I thought he was there with his Singaporean girlfriend. The woman from the airline had 2 children with him. The Singaporean woman had 2 children as well, and the Thai woman had 1. All the children were younger than mine. I kept finding signs of his infidelity. Once, I walked through a hotel and saw him having breakfast with the woman he traveled with. Another time, I saw them drive past me in his car. I even found a fake trust document that he created for the Singaporean woman, putting her in the family trust. The whole time, I was stuck in a foreign country without access to money, credit, or a driver's license. I hadn't lived in the States for years and couldn't even return to my job because of changes in technology. I had an 18-month-old and a 3-year-old, and I was plotting my escape. Eventually, I packed bags and hid them away, trying to figure out how to return to the U.S. Then, he bought me a one-way ticket to visit my parents, and I realized he never planned to let me come back. At that point, I didn't mind. He married the Singaporean woman and cheated on her the whole time. He was engaged to someone else for 4 years while married to her and scammed her out of hundreds of thousands of dollars. Eventually, he dumped her, moved to another country, and remarried, still never divorcing the Singaporean woman. I don't think their marriage was even legal, since they married before we were officially divorced. It took me 7 years to divorce him. The most awkward dinner I ever had was when our oldest graduated from graduate school. He came back to the States with the woman he had been engaged to for 4 years, while still married to the woman he was married to while still married to me. Are you following this? Anyway, she was a high-ranking government official, and I liked her very much. On the way to dinner, my daughter explained to her friend, "So, we're going to dinner with my dad, who cheated on my mom with the woman we're trying to keep secret from his girlfriend, who we're having dinner with." There's more. When our youngest was 10 months old, he suggested we take a trip to Hong Kong to work on things. We flew separately because of his meeting, but I soon realized he probably traveled separately because he was sleeping with most of the flight attendants. When I arrived at the hotel, the front desk greeted me, saying, "Welcome back, Mrs. Z. I see you and Mr. Z were here last week as well." Turns out, it was the other Mrs. Z. Oh, and he gave me an STD when I was pregnant with our second child. Story 6. I had just returned home from a 5-month cruise. My girlfriend at the time worked as a court stenographer, so whenever she wasn't at the pier, I figured she had a case or was catching up on her transcripts. I got a ride from a friend to my house, only to find an unfamiliar BMW parked in my driveway. I walked in to see her giving some random guy a blowy on my couch. Just to clarify, this was my house, not hers. I didn't say a word to her. I just started packing up her things and throwing them into the front yard. I called her father to come and get her since her car was an old Quattro and, as usual, was in the shop. I'd been letting her drive mine until it was fixed. I won't drag out the drama, but she ended up being taken by the MAs instead of her dad. Story 7. My ex-husband and his family have always been heavy marijuana users, and it's a habit they still continue to this day. His sister, their kids, and the nanny had come into town from out of state for a few weeks. When it was time for them to head home, they decided to leave their stash at my ex-mother-in-law's house to avoid taking it on the plane with them. My ex reached out to me, asking if I could pick it up since I was nearby. Looking back, I can't believe I agreed, but I did. I don't smoke, but I was willing to help him out and transport it for him. What I didn't expect was to find a note left by the nanny. It was addressed to my ex and confessed that she was in love with him. She wrote how much she appreciated the time they had spent together. It was clear from her words that she had hoped he would retrieve the weed rather than me. The whole situation was gut-wrenching and left me feeling deeply hurt. But as painful as it was in the moment, I can now say that 15 years later, I am thriving. That chapter of my life, though tough, led me to a much better place, and I'm living my best life now. Story 8. My ex-husband and his family have always had a strong connection to marijuana, a habit they still maintain to this day. It was something that was very much a part of their daily lives. At one point, his sister, their children, and the nanny all came to visit from out of state for a few weeks. As their time in town came to an end and they were preparing to head back home, they made the decision to leave their stash at my ex-mother-in-law's house. They didn't want to risk bringing it with them on the plane, so they left it behind. Since I happened to be nearby, my ex reached out and asked if I could pick it up for him. Looking back now, I can't believe I agreed to do it, but at the time, I was willing to help. I don't smoke, and I didn't have any personal interest in the marijuana, but I figured it would be no big deal to carry it in my car for him. What I didn't anticipate was finding a note from the nanny, tucked away with the stash. The letter was addressed to my ex-husband, and what it said absolutely floored me. She poured her heart out, confessing that she was in love with him. She went on about how much she had cherished the time they spent together, and it was clear from her words that she had been hoping he would come to get the weed instead of me. Reading that note was like a punch to the gut. It hurt so deeply, and at the time, it felt like a betrayal of the highest order. But despite how painful it was in the moment, I can honestly say that I'm grateful for what that experience eventually led to. 15 years later, I am in a much better place. That chapter of my life, as difficult as it was, ultimately helped me grow, and I'm now living my best life, free from the pain and heartache that once held me back. Story 9. I started an open relationship with a girl who had recently left an abusive relationship. Things were going really well. We clicked, had great chemistry, and she even told me no one had ever treated her as well as I did. The intimacy was amazing too. But about 4 months in, she went out one night and didn't respond to any of my texts. At first, I thought maybe she was just out having fun, so I didn't think much of it. The next day, she texted me at 2 p.m. saying, "I just woke up, got really drunk, and spent the night with my ex. We didn't do anything, just talked and cuddled." I was worried since he used to be abusive, but I trusted her. A month later, I was taking care of my father in hospice as he was dying of cancer. We were talking every day, but then, 9 days after my father's death, she asks to go out alone for the night. This was strange, especially since we didn't usually spend every night together. I got drunk, thinking about my dad, and went over to her place looking for some comfort. She wasn't home, but when I called her, she was at her ex's house, insisting they weren't doing anything. I left and went home. 10 days later, after we had a wonderful camping weekend together. No fights, no issues. She breaks up with me, saying she needed space and that we weren't communicating well. I had sensed some distance from her, but it still hit hard. Turns out, my friends had seen her and her ex together frequently in the weeks leading up to the breakup. So not only did she cheat on me, but she did it with her past abuser, the same man who had hurt her while I was caring for my dying father. Every time I think of my dad, I can't help but think of her. It shattered my sense of self-worth. I can't say I wish her the best anymore. It's hard to watch her continue to spiral, getting back into unhealthy habits and being with someone who treated her so poorly. Honestly, I'm glad she's with someone who's just as broken as she is now. Story 10. My ex was a heavy drinker, something I never quite shared a taste for. She was always frequenting a local bar near our place, often hanging out with her friends. I rarely joined them because I wasn't a fan of bars, or the kind of crowd she usually drank with. However, one night, she went out with a couple I didn't mind too much. I was feeling bored and restless at home, so I decided to head over to the bar for a bit and see what was going on. As I walked in, I immediately spotted my ex sitting at the bar with the couple. The place was packed, but the moment our eyes met, I noticed something in her expression, a strange look that instantly made me feel uneasy. She quickly turned to the guy sitting next to her, and without saying a word, he got up and walked away. I didn't know what to make of it at first, and I convinced myself I was just being paranoid. I stayed for about an hour, trying to ignore the weird feeling lingering in the back of my mind, and then I left. But that feeling wouldn't go away, so later that night, I found myself checking one of her friends' Facebook profiles. As I scrolled through, I discovered that this random guy from the bar was actually friends with one of my ex's friends. That gave me a name and a sinking feeling in my stomach. It turned out my gut wasn't wrong, and I wasn't as crazy as I had originally thought. I decided to keep this information to myself for the moment, not wanting to jump to conclusions. The following weekend, she went out drinking again, and this time she didn't come home until around 4 a.m. I tried reaching out to her multiple times, but I didn't get a response. The next morning, she came stumbling through the door at 7 a.m. and immediately jumped in the shower. That's when I decided to check her phone. While she was in the shower, I found a thread of messages between her and that same guy from the bar. The texts were full of information that told me everything I needed to know. It wasn't just a friendship, it was something more. By the time she was still in the shower, I had already made up my mind. I grabbed a fresh set of clothes, packed up, and headed straight to my best friend's house. About 20 minutes later, I got a phone call from my ex, absolutely losing her mind. She was furious that I had left without saying anything, but I couldn't help but laugh at the way she was projecting. I told her flatly that if she wasn't moved out by Monday, I'd be calling the police to have her removed. She wasn't on the lease, and her parents lived just 10 minutes away. That was it. There was no going back. She didn't take me seriously at first, but I was done. I had no intention of dealing with her lies anymore. Story 11. He went to Hawaii for a business trip, leaving his wife and kids behind. As a dutiful wife, I took care of everything before he left, packing his clothes and making sure he had everything he needed. When he came back, I unpacked his suitcase and did the usual routine of sorting through his things. That's when I found a small pair of white cotton panties hidden among his clothes. They weren't lace, just simple cotton bikinis. They were unlabeled, and though they seemed to have been made for a woman, the style was basic enough that they could have been men's as well. At the time, he had been on a health kick and had lost quite a bit of weight, over 100 pounds. He tried to explain the panties away by saying he'd bought them for himself. It didn't make much sense, but I let it slide. What really stuck with me, though, was the pretty brunette who had followed him off the plane at the airport. She kept glancing over at me and the kids as we stood at the luggage carousel. It was such an awkward and unnecessary move on his part to have his side piece come face-to-face with his wife and kids. I couldn't believe he had no shame in making that moment so public. From that point on, I decided to make sure he wore those panties at least once a week for the remaining few months we were together. I set out his clothes every day, and there was no way he could protest. I made sure he had no choice but to wear them, a small but satisfying act of revenge that made me feel a little better about the whole mess. It wasn't much, but it was something. Story 12. It wasn't one big, dramatic moment that caused everything to unravel. It was a series of smaller things, each one chipping away at the trust. Like how she would cancel plans at the last minute without any real explanation. Or the random phone calls from unknown numbers she'd get back when spam calls weren't nearly as common as they are now. There was also that one night when her phone was mysteriously off just when I needed to reach her. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, and my suspicions only grew. Eventually, it all clicked into place when I did some Instagram snooping. I found a guy who followed her, and in one of his posts, he was wearing a very distinctive jacket, one that I knew for sure belonged to her. That was the final piece of the puzzle. The next day, I confronted her. She denied everything. There were tears, desperate pleas, all the usual drama. But I had seen enough. I ended it and walked away. The following day, I messaged the guy on Instagram, and he confirmed everything. He had no idea I even existed, and as a result, he dumped her too. The last I heard, she's an EMT somewhere in Utah or Wyoming. I hope she's figured out how to be a better person, though honestly, I'm not holding my breath. Story 13. For years ago, I was dating a girl who started pulling away from me, becoming distant and uninterested in many of the things we used to enjoy together. I tried to talk to her about it, but instead of opening up, she just grew more detached. She started making herself less available, claiming she was working late more often. My suspicions started growing when I noticed how often she was on her phone. I brought it up, but once again, she refused to engage in any real conversation. What really stood out to me, though, was that she didn't seem to want to break up with me, even though she was clearly pulling away. It didn't make sense. I had actually decided to end things on my own, but one weekend when she was supposedly unavailable, some mutual friends told me they had spotted her with a guy from her work. They were all over each other, acting like a couple. Coincidentally, she had also lent me her iPad, which was synced with her phone. I saw a ton of text between her and this guy over that weekend. They were talking about running away together, making all sorts of plans. It turned out he was married, and also her supervisor at work. Some of our mutual friends, who were also her coworkers, reported them to HR. The fallout was pretty intense. They were both forced to go through training on not having relationships with coworkers, and they were both denied promotions. His wife left him, and my ex ended up moving overseas. It was crushing at the time, and I was devastated by the whole thing. But in the end, karma really came through for them. They both got exactly what they deserved. Story 14. This isn't my story, but it's about my parents. When my mom met my dad, she was in a relationship with someone else. She ended things with her boyfriend to be with my dad. Fast forward about 10 years, and they were married with 2 kids, my older brother and me. My mom traveled for work fairly often, and eventually, she started making trips to see her friend in Chicago. I don't really remember when it began, but I do remember noticing that my dad would get increasingly irritable on the weekends she was away. I think I was around 12 when I finally put things together. I figured it out before my brother did. I would sit at the top of the stairs and listen to my parents argue. I'm not sure if I heard something specific that gave it away, if it slowly dawned on me as I got older, or if one day it just hit me. All I know is that it became clear to me over time that my mom lied. Still does. My dad used to beg me not to tell her that I knew what was going on. He was desperate to keep the family together, and on top of that, my mom would have been furious if she found out he had involved the kids. No exaggeration. Then one summer, after I graduated high school, I came home from work to find my mom loading blankets into her car in the garage. I asked her why, and for a moment, she got quiet before saying, "Well, I'm moving out." I just went inside without saying anything. Later, she sent my dad a text message saying she had moved to her brother's house. That's how he found out. They'd been married for 20 years, and she ended it over a text message. I'll never know if she planned on telling me at all, or if she was just going to disappear without a word. There were times when she'd leave without telling me where she was going. I'd notice she was gone and ask my dad about it, and he'd say, "Oh, she didn't tell you? She's in Montreal for the week," or something like that. So, anything was possible. Story 15. June 1st, 2018. It started out like any normal day, a Friday. My husband kissed me goodbye before heading off to work, and I was busy cleaning the house in preparation for company who would be staying with us for the weekend. Then, the doorbell rang. When I opened it, there was a man standing on the other side. He introduced himself as the husband of a woman my husband worked with. What he said next shattered my world. He was there to tell me that my husband and his wife had been having an affair. Apparently, he had caught them about 6 months earlier and told his wife she had to end it. She claimed to have ended it for about 3 months, but it had started up again. When he found out, he called my husband, knowing that if he confronted him face to face, he'd end up in jail for what he wanted to do. On the phone, he warned my husband to leave his wife alone, or else he would come and tell me everything. My husband must have thought he was bluffing. So, I was literally the last to know. My husband never came home again. He rented an Airbnb and hired a lawyer. Our divorce was finalized on December 21st, 2018. We had been together for 24 years. The pain still lingers. Story 16. June 1st, 2018. It started out like any normal day, a Friday. My husband kissed me goodbye before heading off to work, and I was busy cleaning the house in preparation for company who would be staying with us for the weekend. Then, the doorbell rang. When I opened it, there was a man standing on the other side. He introduced himself as the husband of a woman my husband worked with. What he said next shattered my world. He was there to tell me that my husband and his wife had been having an affair. Apparently, he had caught them about 6 months earlier and told his wife she had to end it. She claimed to have ended it for about 3 months, but it had started up again. When he found out, he called my husband, knowing that if he confronted him face to face, he'd end up in jail for what he wanted to do. On the phone, he warned my husband to leave his wife alone, or else he would come and tell me everything. My husband must have thought he was bluffing. So, I was literally the last to know. My husband never came home again. He rented an Airbnb and hired a lawyer. Our divorce was finalized on December 21st, 2018. We had been together for 24 years. The pain still lingers. Story 17. The husband of one of the women my ex was cheating on me with called me at work. At first, I didn't believe him and hung up. How could the man I had spent the past 8 years with, the father of our 2 beautiful children, the person I had shared the heartbreaking loss of one of our kids with, do something so hurtful? But even then, a part of me was unsure. He had cheated in past relationships, and we had gone through a rocky patch early on where I suspected something but never had the proof. I told my boss I was feeling sick and had to leave early. Once I got outside, I called the guy back. That's when I learned the truth. My ex, his wife, and one of their friends had been sleeping together for about a year. The man had confronted my ex, and my ex convinced him to wait a month before telling me, citing that my mother had just passed away. When I got home, I took my time before confronting him. I told him to pack his things and leave. Over the next few days, I started piecing together everything, the lies he had told me, and all the red flags I had missed. If I had been in a different headspace, maybe I would have caught on earlier. I also found videos hidden on one of our computers. It turned out he had been having booty calls in our apartment while I was at work, and he was supposed to be watching our daughter. At that point, any chance of reconciliation was completely shattered. Story 18. It was one of those classic love at first sight stories. We were madly in love after just 2 weeks, moved in together after 2 months, and were engaged after 6. We'd been together for over 4 years by the time everything fell apart. I left my rent-controlled bachelor pad to move into a bigger apartment so she could have her art studio. We did everything together and split all bills 50-50ths. We worked in the same industry, had similar jobs, and made about the same amount of money. We truly loved each other, and as cliche as it sounds, we really did complete each other. I was the analytical, stoic one, and she was the liberal artist. One year, she was off to Comic-Con in NYC for work. She was an expositor, so I helped her pack and dropped her off at the airport. Everything was fine, no signs of anything unusual. She was supposed to come home in 4 days, but she never did. She just disappeared, ghosted me. On the day she was supposed to return, I completely freaked out, thinking something had happened to her, but then I realized she had blocked me on everything. Email, phone, social media, the works. All I knew about what happened came from the bills she left behind. Unpaid bills, and our shared credit card, which she had stopped paying 2 months earlier. T-Mobile even gave me a log of her cell phone usage since it was still linked to my SSN. As I combed through the records, I found a particular NYC area code listed repeatedly. I started to put 2 and 2 together. She'd met someone at San Diego Comic-Con months earlier and had been systematically planning to leave me, take as much as she could, and start over in NYC. The real twist came when I discovered she had maxed out both our credit card and our Amazon card, buying furniture and supplies for their new place in NYC. By the time I realized what was happening, it was too late for me to cancel anything. I had to sit there and watch her purchases, made with my money, for a house I would never set foot in. I couldn't afford to stay in our house on my own, and the life we had built together was now out of reach. For months, I fell into a blackout drunk, self-loathing spiral. I'm sure I hurt others along the way in my haze of anger and pain. It wasn't just the love that devastated me. It was the betrayal and the financial wreckage she left behind. It took over a year of living paycheck to pay off the debt and get everything back to zero. Story 19. It's funny how the girl he was cheating on me with actually ended up telling me. She messaged me at 3 in the morning, asking if I was still with my ex. I replied, yes, he's asleep next to me. Why? She then spilled everything, sent me screenshots, and I immediately grabbed his phone. I believed her, of course, but I wanted to see it all for myself. I stepped out of the room and went through his phone. He didn't even try to hide it. When I saw everything, I went back into the room, threw something at him to wake him up, and confronted him. Naturally, he played dumb, denying everything and saying he had no idea who I was talking about. Then I said, oh, okay, maybe this will jog your memory, and pulled his phone out of my pocket. The look on his face when he saw it, priceless. He knew it was over. I screamed at him, called him every name I could think of, and he ended up leaving the house. That was a year ago. A few months after that, I get messages from him saying he misses me. It's honestly pathetic. Story 20. It was the day before my 18th birthday when everything went downhill. My boyfriend had planned a special evening for us. He told me he was going to take me out in his Mazda pickup, Sparky, and we drive down to a bigger city for some food and just enjoy the night together. I went to school, had a good day, and everything seemed fine. I got home and waited. I called him a few times, but no answer. I just waited. By the time it was nearly 9:30 to 10 p.m., I had enough. I got on the computer and discovered through a mutual friend that he was over at another friend's house. This friend, we were all close, but her home life was a mess. Her parents were horrible to her, and she'd been talking about leaving with her younger brother. So, I got in my mom's car and drove over there. When I walked in, I found them in the living room, banging on the couch. I didn't say a word. I just went home, told my mom he wasn't welcome at our house, and I wasn't taking his calls. I was exhausted, so I went to bed, planning to deal with everything in the morning. The next morning, he showed up like nothing had happened. He greeted me with a hug, and I backed away. When he asked what was wrong, I told him he'd missed our special night because he was too busy getting his fill of someone else. He accused me of stalking him, of cheating, and even tried to gaslight me, calling me controlling. I told him it was over. He made his bed with her, so now he could lie in it. If he liked her more, then they should be together. I told our mutual friends that we'd broken up over some disagreements, but it didn't stop the rumor mill. She spread it around school, saying she was a better lay than I was. So, yeah, that happened. Story 21. I married him when I was 18 and he was 21. He was shipping off to sea, and I was trying to escape a terrible home life. When he came back after his deployment, he wasn't the same person. About 6 months later, he purposely gained weight to fail his physical so he could get kicked out of the Navy. A year later, I was working full-time while he stayed home, watching anime, drinking, and telling me he was applying to jobs. One day, My laptop broke while I was working on university applications. I asked to use his, and while I was on it, a message popped up on his Facebook, a topless picture from his ex. Shocked, I opened it and saw that they had been talking the whole time he was away. He'd been lying, telling me he didn't have time to email, but he had plenty of time for her. She sent him the picture because he'd told her how much he missed having big fun bags to play with, and how mine were too small, making him feel like he was with a boy or a child. I confronted him, and he came up with pitiful excuses. I had my friends come over that day and kick him out while I went to work. He stalked me for years after. He'd post on Facebook about how I was a coward and send me blocked calls and emails saying things like, "A restraining order is just a piece of paper, and that our vows before God made me his property." He bought a gun and started telling our friends that, if he couldn't have me, no one could. I had to be strategic, giving conflicting information about where I was going and eventually moving states. I deleted all my social media and lived in constant fear while he continued to post creepy memes about how much he loved me and would do anything to get me back. It took me 8 years to finally get a divorce. Story 22. I was at work, trying to call my boyfriend, but he wasn't answering. Hours went by, and I just had this terrible feeling. For some reason, it stressed me out so much that I started crying, and my boss let me leave early. On the way home, I couldn't shake this feeling of dread. I walked in the door, went to the bedroom, and found him lying in bed half-clothed with some naked girl. Of course, all hell broke loose, but after everything calmed down, this guy tried to tell me that he'd gone to the movies alone, met her there, and that she just followed him home. Like, even if I somehow believed that a random person just followed you home and stripped down, you still let her. So what's the point of saying that to me? It was a toxic, abusive relationship that didn't even end right away. I eventually broke up with him, but not as soon as I should have. If I could change anything, it would be breaking up with him right then and there. But that was over 10 years ago. Story 23. This all started back in December, right before we were about to leave for a holiday trip to visit my family. She started acting distant, getting easily aggravated, and just seemed off. I had a gut feeling something was up, and I'm honestly embarrassed to admit that I snooped on her iWatch. I found some texts that were pretty damning, so I confronted her in January. She told me she kissed a guy she works with, but that was it. We had been going through some issues in our relationship, and I decided to forgive her. We agreed to work on things. Fast forward to this past May, and she finally admitted she hadn't been truthful with me. She'd actually slept with the guy. After that, we broke up. We had been together for 8 years and engaged for almost 2. Our wedding was supposed to be yesterday. It's still tearing me up inside. I have no idea where to go from here. 2020 can just go screw itself. Story 24. This story is remarkable because it happened back in the early 90s, before the internet was widely available, when the world felt so much bigger. My fiancée, Meg, had 1 semester left in college that she needed to complete as an internship abroad for her major. She chose Belgium for her internship. I stayed behind, and the plan was for me to set up our house. When she returned that summer, she would move in, and we'd start planning our wedding. While Meg was in Europe, calling every couple of weeks, since long distance was ridiculously expensive back then, sending postcards and letters, I moved into a brownstone, bought furniture, and started preparing for our future. About 2 weeks before Meg was supposed to come back, I stopped by a local coffee shop I had noticed down the block but hadn't yet visited. To my surprise, my childhood neighbor, Claire, was working there as a waitress. We hadn't seen each other since high school, so we decided to meet up after her shift for a coffee and catch up. During our conversation, she told me that she was also engaged to a man named Ben, who was in Belgium doing the same internship Meg was doing. I couldn't believe the coincidence and told Claire all about Meg, convinced they had to know each other. Wild, right? A couple of days later, I went back for another coffee, and Claire looked visibly upset. She asked if I had time to talk, as she was on a break and needed to tell me something. We stepped outside, and she told me that her Aunt Sue, who had just returned from Czechoslovakia, had shared a strange story. While touring Prague, Aunt Sue had stayed at a local hotel with her travel group. The next morning, she ran into Claire's fiancé, Ben, in the hotel lobby, with a woman named Meg. Ben introduced her as a fellow American student they worked with, but the whole situation felt awkward and tense. Claire immediately called Belgium, and after a lot of persistence, finally got Ben on the phone. She confronted him about the encounter, and he admitted that he had been seeing Meg the whole time they were in Europe, traveling together on weekends and holidays. I was stunned. I went home and tried calling Meg at her dorm in Belgium. After some effort, I finally reached her late at night, which was early morning for her. I directly asked her if she was dating Ben, without explaining how I knew. At first, she acted like I was crazy, But when I mentioned Claire's name, she dropped the act and admitted everything. When Meg came back, it was a bittersweet homecoming for both her and Ben. Meg had it easier. Claire had already packed up all of Ben's belongings and left them on the front lawn 2 weeks before. When Ben came back, most of his things were already gone. I did pick Meg up from the airport, though. I think part of me just wanted to see her face when I told her that everyone knew what a piece of crap she was and that I never wanted to see her again. To this day, I marvel at the incredible series of random coincidences that led to Meg and Ben getting caught. The universe has a mysterious way of working things out. Story 25. I accidentally discovered my ex-husband's affair. We had both gone to work in the evening, and I couldn't get into my office due to a building issue. He offered to let me use his office to print something. He went for a walk to get his steps, and while I was working on his computer, that's when I noticed he was logged into Facebook, and I just had a gut feeling. I browsed through his messages and found he'd been chatting with a woman he'd met abroad through our work. I copied everything I could and confronted him when he came back. I insisted he take me for a drink, where I told him there would be no reconciliation. He was in shock, and I told him to go home and pack a bag. That was 6 months ago, and I'm really relieved to have let go of the dead weight. He was emotionally abusive, but I lived my vows, tried to help him, and reorganized my life around him. I'm finally free. Story 26. My boyfriend asked me to look for something on his computer, and I couldn't find it at first. While I was waiting for clearer instructions, I noticed a message pop up in the corner about how she misses him or something like that. Curious, I clicked on it, and she sent a picture. Weird, right? So, I dug a little deeper. Through Facebook, I found out he's been talking to over 100 women. All of them are either sending him explicit pictures or thanking him for money. I kept looking and found a link to a money-sending site, kind of like PayPal. I clicked it and saw the transaction history, 4 total pages, 20 items per page. Over $500 sent for nude pictures. That's more than half my monthly paycheck. We've been together for 15 years, have a child together, and I'm on disability while he doesn't work. I'm furious. I've told him countless times that I don't care if he watches porn or talks to other women, but he's lied and said he's never done it before, all while doing this the entire time. The kicker? We broke up, I got cancer, and he moved back in, all while still doing this for over 7 years. Story 27. He had the audacity to sext a woman at my dad's birthday dinner, right at the table. He had her saved as Sam, a work friend, so I assumed they weren't texting in that way. I pulled him outside to talk, and he lied, saying it was an old high school girlfriend going through a divorce who needed comfort. I knew that was a lie because he didn't have girlfriends in high school. I started crying, and his response was to tell me to stop crying. That was the moment I knew our marriage was over. How could he be so cold to me when I just discovered he was cheating? Later, I found out he'd been sexting random women and even hiring prostitutes. We've been officially divorced for about 2.5 months now, and today would have been our 5th wedding anniversary. It's a tough day. Story 28. My ex-husband and I were sitting down when I heard a knock at the door. He answered it, and a woman I had never seen before stood there, crying as soon as she saw me. My heart dropped, and a rush of anger hit me, like my body knew what was happening before my mind caught up. I was holding my infant son, and all I could think was, stay calm. I asked what was going on, and he told me it was an old high school friend in trouble. I tried to brush it off, thinking maybe I was overreacting. I was only 17 at the time, married to a 23-year-old, with a traumatic childhood. My mother was a heroin addict who lost custody of me when I was 5, and I was sent to live with my dad, who kicked me out at 16 because his girlfriend didn't like me. I had no support, no friends, no family. So when I found attention in my next-door neighbor, I clung to it. He took advantage of me, and I take some responsibility for not protecting myself, but I was a child desperate for love and validation. Anyway, they stood on the porch talking for nearly an hour, and I saw him kiss her forehead and rub her back. It shattered me because I felt like I knew her, even though I'd never met her. He'd talked about this woman before, how he'd had feelings for her for years, but she was always with someone else, eventually getting married. He came inside and told me she was moving into our 2-bedroom home. I was furious, especially because I had never met her, and we didn't have the space. I asked him why he was doing this without discussing it with me, and why he was kissing her. He explained that her husband had cheated on her and abused her, and she had nowhere else to go. But she had parents nearby who could have helped, and I wasn't okay with her moving in. He told me I was selfish and insecure, and that I should know what it's like to have nowhere to go. He made me feel worthless. He moved our son into our bedroom, found her a job at his workplace, and oddly enough, they had the same shift. She never slept in the room he'd furnished for her, and never showered at the house, only appeared when it was time to go to work. He made me pack her lunches for her late shifts, and sometimes he'd drop her off at her mom's. One day, she left a note saying she was moving in with her mom and didn't want to give a reason. When I confronted him, he exploded, telling me he loved her and always would. He said I wasn't half the woman she was, and if I kept pressing, he'd kick me out and keep our son. I was terrified, so I didn't push any further. Later that night, he came home with a broken hand and cuts, claiming he'd punched machinery at work out of frustration. For the next 6 years, he cheated on and off, bragging about women wanting him. He eventually got into a relationship with another coworker. I eventually fled the relationship. I'm now happily remarried. My husband and I were together for 7 years before we got engaged. My ex married his mistress 2 months after our divorce was finalized, and honestly, they deserve each other. And yes, his first mistress is still on his social media. Story 29. My now ex-husband casually mentioned that his coworker, a woman, was having marriage problems. The details he shared weren't casual at all. They were things you only confide in someone you trust deeply. That raised a red flag for me, and I told him to be careful, warning that she might be using him as an excuse to end her marriage. About a month later, he decided to take a day-long road trip, saying it was just to do his own thing. He set his alarm early, showered, shaved, and as he was about to leave, he asked, "Do I look okay?" That day, I decided to investigate, so I used a keylogger on his computer. 2 days later, I found out that he had been with the coworker that day and was even telling her about all the nice things he wanted to buy her when they were together. I called her husband, and we talked. He filed for divorce immediately. I, on the other hand, tried to work things out with my husband. Years later, my husband started needing a lot more alone time. He stayed up later after I went to bed, got up earlier, and worked longer hours. Once again, my concerns about him cheating flared up. This time, a keylogger wouldn't help since everything was on his phone. I checked the phone bill and saw that he was making numerous calls to a single number. He talked to this person more than he talked to me. I didn't try to work it out this time. By then, he had been unemployed for 2 years, claiming he was looking for a job but doing nothing around the house. Literally nothing. He wouldn't even mow the lawn. When I suggested hiring a landscaper, he didn't want to do that either. He couldn't even make the phone call. He denied the affair, but at that point, I told him it didn't matter. I wanted a divorce. I believe he moved in with her as soon as I filed. Good riddance. He's her problem now. The last I heard from his sister, he still wasn't working, and he and his new wife were living off a settlement she received, which was running out. He even had the audacity to ask my lawyer for maintenance, alimony. I told him, "No, you lazy bastard. You have a degree and once had a career. It's not my fault you chose not to work." Story 30. My best friend caught his ex cheating in a pretty hilarious way. She was sneaky about it, using a shared Google Doc to chat with the guy. My friend didn't realize anything was off until he asked to use her notes for a class they had together. While browsing, he came across a doc called Sly Cooper, which caught his attention. When he read it, he quickly pieced everything together. So, he decided to have some fun with it. While she was in class and wouldn't be able to access the doc, he started leaving weird messages for the guy. When the guy responded, my friend would delete both his own message and the guy's reply. He figured out a pattern of when the guy would reply, and did the same thing the other way around. Eventually, he set it up so that they both thought they were going on a holiday together, with the other paying for everything. I honestly still don't know how he pulled that off, but his ex wasn't exactly the sharpest tool in the shed, so it made sense. Fast forward to the day of the holiday. He sees his ex and the guy meeting up for their supposed romantic weekend. They start arguing about why the other hasn't bought tickets yet. My friend texts his ex and tells her to check the Google Doc. It just says, "Go screw yourselves," along with a selfie of him with the couple in the background. I really wish I could have seen their reactions. Story 31. My wife was on vacation in another country with her parents when things started to fall apart between us. After a huge fight, she ended up staying a month longer than she initially said she would. Eventually, she broke up with me, and, naturally, I was heartbroken. She stayed a few more days in the country before confirming she was flying back, but only to move out her stuff. Her phone was linked to my Google account, so any pictures she took would automatically upload to my account. A day or two after the breakup, I logged into my photo account, thinking I'd look back on our memories. Instead, I was blindsided by a picture of her getting cozy with a guy in a van, kissing him. Turns out, she had been seeing this guy behind my back for weeks. We'd been best friends in high school, together for 10 years, and married for 6. At first, I didn't feel anything. No anger, no sadness. We weren't in an open relationship, but I understood her on a level where I could imagine what she might have been going through. Maybe the spark was gone. Maybe she didn't see me as a romantic partner anymore. I didn't want to keep her in a relationship she wasn't happy in, especially since she was my best friend. Months passed, and she followed through with her plan. She divorced me and went back to the country she'd been vacationing in, saying she was staying a little while. She ended up marrying the guy and having a few kids with him. The plot twist? The guy she met while on vacation was her ex-boyfriend. I didn't recognize him because, from the few pictures I'd seen of him years before, he didn't have a mustache. And that's when the anger hit me. Pure, unfiltered anger. She knew this was the one person in the world I would have never wanted her to end up with. I'd always wondered why something fell off during our breakup, why she suddenly seemed so distant. Turns out, it was because she was reconnecting with the one guy I considered a scumbag for how he treated her in the past. She knew how badly I'd react if I found out, and kept it hidden from me. It hurt even more when I found out she'd always been hesitant to have kids, but within just a few years of our divorce, she had 2 kids with him. It took a few years to recover from everything. I dated around, but eventually, I found myself in a great relationship with a girl who, honestly, is the best thing that's ever happened to me. Story 32. While I was deployed, she started seeing the guy renting the basement. What she didn't know was that I had installed cameras during the renovation. I kept everything quiet while I gathered evidence. When I got back, I went straight to work. The videos revealed a lot more than just her affair. They showed significant neglect of our kids, enough to make me take action. I arranged for a friend to provide childcare, so I knew the kids were safe while I was away. She was a stay-at-home mom, but instead of caring for our toddlers and 7-year-old, she ignored them and spent her days chatting with men online and meeting a few of them. I kept a close eye on everything, quietly documenting it all. I even told her she needed to get a job if she wasn't going to contribute to the household. The final straw came when I found out she was pregnant by her boss. I knew I was fixed, so I didn't have to worry about that. When I confronted her, she said she needed time to find herself. I told her she could find herself living somewhere else. She left willingly, and we didn't hear from her for 6 months. That was all I needed to build an abandonment case. After a long battle in court, I became a single dad with full custody of our 3 kids, and we've never been happier. Here's the kicker. The oldest child isn't mine biologically. He's from a previous relationship of hers. She abandoned him with me, but he's my son in every way that matters. Sometimes I wonder if I ever really knew her at all. Story 33. All of these answers are about people who caught their spouses cheating, but I briefly became the other woman, unknowingly, and it's something that's never sat right with me. I was young, single, and going through a family crisis after my sibling unexpectedly passed away. I met a guy who seemed fun, great, and very busy. Exactly what I was looking for at the time since I wasn't in a place for anything serious. After 4 months of romance, I found out he was actually married with small children. It came out when we were at a bar with his colleagues, and one of them casually asked where his wife was. I kept my composure and didn't make a scene, but as soon as the night ended, I had to bring it up. I told him how terrible it made me feel to find out. I ended up just ghosting him after that. I wasn't in the mental state to handle the fallout, so I stopped replying to his messages. I should have contacted his wife, but I didn't want to get caught up in playing relationship police. At the time, I was dealing with a lot of stress and grief and didn't have the emotional capacity for it. It's been 5 years, and I still feel awful for his wife whenever I think about what happened. Sometimes, I consider reaching out to her and telling her everything, but I'm torn about whether it's the right thing to do or even worth it. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an update.